Hi students, let's talk about reading rhetorically and annotating text today. So how might reading for academic or workplace purposes, how might that be different from other kind of readings that you do, such as maybe accessing the news or scrolling through social media or maybe opening a book? How might that differ? Do you feel like you ever struggle with finding the right strategies? So do you use the same type of strategy that you do for all your type of reading? Do you employ different strategies for different purposes? What do you do? So what is your process? Maybe you skim or read it very closely the first time through. What do you do? Does it depend? Do you print your materials and read them very carefully? Do you always print? Do you read from the screen or your phone or your computer, or does it depend? What about highlighting? Do you highlight? Do you underline? Do you take notes? Do you do nothing at all? Or again, does it depend? What about the background noise? Do you have music going? Do you like to have the TV on? Do you need complete silence? Or does it depend? And how has that perhaps even changed since we've been maybe locked in our homes a little bit more during the pandemic? This brings us to our next one. What about where do you read? Do you read at home? Do you read in a public place? What do you prefer? Do you like to be in bed? Or does being in bed make you tired? What is successful for your reading strategies? What about the time of day? Do you read early? Do you read late? Or again, does it depend? These are all things that you really need to think about for your reading processes, especially when it comes to academic reading. When we read for academic purposes or just any kind of time and place where we need to do some sort of close reading, we really have to think about these things because they really, really matter. Some of the strategies we use may be working against us, and some of the strategies we use may be really working for us. So you really have to think about what is working for you, because when you read for academic purposes, you're doing close reading. You're reading for all the details, you're reading for the content, and then when you are a writer, you're also reading for other purposes. So this brings me to my next question. Do you ever read like a writer? And why might you want to do that? Well, just quite frankly, to answer the question, you want to read like a writer because looking at writing can serve as a model for your own writing. So I know, for example, in English 1010, maybe you were asked to read something in the same vein or the same genre as what you were writing in. Why? Because it helps. It helps us to see it in action. So when you're reading like a writer, you're not only examining the content, what did they write about, and what details did they use, what sources did they use, but you're also looking at it in terms of, are there some rhetorical moves that I can use as a writer myself to make my writing better? Was there a particular tone that they used, and how did they bring that tone across? Did they organize their piece in a way that really made you stop and think? Did they ask rhetorical questions? Did they slam you with source after source to the point where you were like, wow, you know what? They're really right about this. So all of these are different strategies. That's why it's really important for you to not only read for content and to read closely so that you can understand what the source is saying to you, but also pick up those rhetorical moves that you want to utilize yourself. All right, so there's some strategies for reading rhetorically. When we read rhetorically, that's what I mean as far as your rhetorical analysis. You're looking at the rhetorical moves they made or how they constructed it, how they put everything together. All right. One thing that you'll do, especially if you're considering a source, you will want to preview the text. This is particularly important when you're looking for sources, and we're going to talk about lateral reading more this semester, and that'll make a little more sense to you. You want to think about genre. So you want to look at what kind of piece are you working with? Is it some kind of academic genre? Is it a public genre? And how does that matter? Well, let me give you an example. Let's say, because in a minute we're going to examine an op-ed in the New York Times. That is going to be written quite differently from an academic journal article. In fact, when you read a news article, such as from the New York Times, you're going to see support for the ideas, but it's going to be written in a totally different style. And the way that they integrate their sources, you're not going to see something that says works cited or references at the end of an op-ed piece. You're going to see those sources linked through hyperlinks throughout the text. It's going to be quite different. So getting to know the genre is one way to get started. You're also going to want to consider their purpose. So see if you can identify somewhere in the piece why the author wrote the piece and how you can figure that out. You may also want to consider the audience. So who is their audience? Are you the intended audience? If not, how does it pertain to you? What will that mean for you as a reader as you take in the information? And then what is the writer doing to appeal to that audience? That brings us to our next point. Consider the use of rhetorical appeal. So is the author qualified to write about this? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be have a doctorate in the field, right? That is helpful, especially for those people writing in academic journal articles. But maybe they have some sort of relationship to the content. And then how do they present that in the content? Do they come across as credible, and how do they develop that? What about pathos? Is there any kind of emotional attachment that they're trying to, any kind of emotional reaction they're trying to pull from you? So do they do that? Do they need to do that? And do they do that well? And then, of course, logos. So is the author making their case? Are they supporting it with evidence? How are they presenting that evidence? What kind of evidence are they using, and is it working for them? You can even consider modes and media. So did they choose to share this information in a traditional way or not? And then how you're able to access the text. And I also want to say, it's really interesting, especially with digital media, to look at how that's all put together, what kind of images are used, hyperlinks, all those kinds of things. What is noticeable to you about the author's style or tone or word choice or the way it's written? Is it very cheeky? Is it very in your face? Is it very much to the point? And then how does that contribute to the article's success or not? Okay, so when you're annotating a text, you're going to be looking for things like key terms, important claims and evidence, key passages, interesting parts, confusing parts, making notes about your own reactions. Do you disagree with part of the text? Do you agree with it? Does something shock you? Hey, even are there words that you don't know? So page 100, and I've shared this with you on D2L, it's going to also give you just basically these same questions, but in a different way, so that you can help think about this as you're reading your text that you're choosing for your first assignment rhetorically. Okay, so I would like for you to pause here and read the problem with lunch. It's linked on D2L. And then when we're done, come back to me and we're going to examine my notes. So pause here and do that. All right, so if you are back with me now, you have read the problem with lunch, which is linked on D2L. I wanted to bring this up. This is what the piece looks like in the New York Times, just like that. And I'm going to pull it up. I actually copied it into Word. And just a little trick, if you ever have an article like that, you can look at just kind of that easy version by clicking up here, and it kind of makes it easier to transfer everything. So I've kind of gone back and forth. I am usually, I love in my books that I'm reading, for example, if I'm taking notes, I like to do a lot of underlining with my purple pen, and I write notes out to the side. I do like doing that a lot, but I've had to learn to work with annotating more in digital mediums because that's just kind of where we are, and it's easier than printing a lot of stuff. So I do things a bit differently depending on what I'm working with. And I think we all have to kind of learn to adapt in that way. For example, maybe you guys have textbooks that you have to take notes from, but you can't write in your textbook, especially if you're renting it or something like that. So you have to kind of learn to work your way around it. All right, so this article, one thing I noticed that's really interesting is the image that's used. There's a fork in this very spiraling mode that eventually lands on an apple. So I already have kind of a decent idea of what this is about. I also have to make note that this is from the New York Times that I just showed you, and it's an op-ed piece. So that gives me an even better idea of how it might be written and how this author may kind of approach this subject matter. And I know it's going to be an opinion piece that's hopefully backed up by some information. All right, so as you can see here, I've done some highlighting and some notes out to the side, just things that kind of popped up to me as I was reading the piece. So one thing I noticed is the author kind of discusses the subject matter and the purpose at the very, very beginning, but I don't exactly get everything, their main point. I don't know their exact main argument yet, but I even have some sort of idea just by the word choice used, like masochistic here. So I'm kind of getting some ideas about her tone and about the purpose of the piece that really stood out to me. I also noticed the author working with the idea of credibility here. So the author is referencing Michael Moore's documentary, which the author has clearly watched, and is using that as sort of a jumping point into the subject matter. I thought that was really a really nice way to jump into this subject. I also noticed the clear credibility brought in here when the author says, as someone who has written about school food for almost 6 years. Boom, perfect example of ethos, right? That's built in here. So that's making me want to trust the author a little bit more here. I really liked how she built that in. And then we kind of are hit here with another point. If only our school districts weren't cheap, mismanaged, or somehow captive to the processed food industry. But the problem with America's school food has little to do with the school themselves. So I'm starting to get a little bit, we're getting a little bit about the assumptions maybe that Americans have, or maybe that readers have, maybe that you have. So I like how the author built that in. Then I start seeing some of the identification of problems and some of the different reasons. The author has also used compare and contrast mode to make the main points here. So there's a steady comparison throughout the piece between France and the US. We have all of our clear reasons, and I've even highlighted some things that stood out to me in the reason. And they're all provided with links that I can click on and go to the sources. I see Pew Charitable Trust, and then there's a link there. So there's a lot that's included in each of the reasons as far as that logos goes. All right, I like here the author concedes that some schools might be proving the exception. They may actually be doing some of the things that other countries are doing, but they're definitely the exception. So I like how they may know that made note that there could be the counter argument of, well, some schools do this. They say, yeah, okay, but that is definitely the exception to the rule. So again, I'm not going to go through exactly all of these, but I want you to see, like, I'm looking at the staggering facts that they link to the sources. They're linking it to the idea of student as customer here, and how there's all kinds of options that are vying for the customer's business, so to speak. And I really like how the author tied the main points together here. Again, great use of compare and contrast. They're saying here the author is really starting to get it's sort of this funnel mode right now. We're getting towards the tip of the funnel. So the author is saying it's more than just about food. They brought it to it being a cultural difference in the problem with lunches. And then interestingly, and I like the way that they're writing it here. I mean, they're pretty in your face about it. It's laughable, right? The way that they're writing it. The author ends here, and this can be more traditional for some op-eds to end with their main point. So their sort of bottom line, their thesis, their main point behind it is that basically, look, we can't compare our school lunches to other countries because it's a totally different society, a totally different culture. And so, it may be easy to laugh at American lunches, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes of that. So as you're reading again, you're taking really close look at how everything's organized, the tone, the word choice, the way they use their sources, the way they establish credibility. So these were things that stood out to me. What stood out to you? You may have noticed something different. And then what I'll challenge you to start thinking about too. So part of this is looking at how it's put together, right? But then the next step is, all right, so what was their point? And then do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Or maybe a little bit of both? That leads us into summary and response.